Everybody, video here for you today. We're going to go down to a place I have not made a video about, I think for about 3 years, 2.5 years, I'm not sure. This is a pretty important place, and we're going to ask some questions. This is the fairly famous site of Çatalhöyük. A couple different mounds here, tells that go back almost, I think about 9,000 years in history. That's what they look like today. There is buildings covering up some areas where they are doing archaeological work at that one mound. And here's the other one right here, but the history here goes way back in time. Here's a story that just came out last week, Coronavirus Silence in Çatalhöyük on the UNESCO list. In Crania, 9,000-year-old Çatalhöyük, one of the first settlements on the UNESCO World Cultural Heritage List, was silent due to the coronavirus. Çatalhöyük, which was visited by local and foreign tourists in every period of the year, remained empty due to the pandemic. Settlement here made up of 2 mounds, 14 hectares in total size. There are 18 different layers of settlements here. And the earliest one dates from around maybe 7100 BC, 7400 BC. I've seen it date as far back as that. So about a little over 9,000 years. Then by about 7,500 years ago, these people were gone. It says in the West Mound there are murals that go back about 8,200 years into history, and I believe these are kind of like a reprint of them in a museum. Here's a look at Çatalhöyük after it was first excavated. Just think about that, between 7,500 and 9,500 years old, roughly. But if you look in here, you can almost see bricks. You kind of see how these were put together. These are unique homes going way back into the Neolithic period. Here is one chart of things datable at Çatalhöyük, things that were dated to over 9,200 years old. Now, I will leave a few links below, but here is a good look at the mound with the roof over it. The UC Merced team was doing work here about 5 years ago. And I remember looking into Çatalhöyük about 3 years ago thinking, man, permanent settlements, homes, 9,000 years old, 18 layers of settlements here. That is just amazing. But then now in the last 2 years, I've done videos on places that go back 3,000 years older than this. It seems in a very short time span, we have pushed human history back about twice as far as we originally thought it first started. Here's a look at some of the excavation work going on at Çatalhöyük. Just think about that, 18 different layers of settlements. That's pretty amazing. Here is one of the earliest excavation sites right down here, kind of near the bottom of the mound. This is Çatalhöyük.com. Here is an obsidian mirror made about 9,000 years ago. Auric horns were found in many of these homes. They seem to be symbolic. Many ancient cultures. Here is a look at the mound, over 22 meters in height. I believe that's what was said. But this is just a fascinating place. There's a look at one of the roof facilities where the archaeological work is going on. Here's a look at what they think one of the homes look like. I actually started a fire in the fireplace, and there's more of those auric horns. There was quite a bit of artwork found at Çatalhöyük. Here is a story from about 6 years ago. In fact, 6 years ago to the date, January 13th, it says Çatalhöyük map mural may depict volcanic eruption 8,900 years ago. And here's what they think this settlement looked like. Now, does that look like Stone Age people or civilized people building a permanent settlement? It says from 1961 to 1965, excavations at the site produced a huge number of artifacts and ancient structures, including a 10-foot wide wall painting of the town in 2 peaks, sometimes referred to as the world's oldest map. Some scientists question this interpretation and argue that the mural, dating to around 6,600 BC, is more likely a decorative geometric design instead of a map, and a painting of a leopard skin instead of 2 peaks. I guess that is all up for interpretation, but one thing is for sure, there are honeycomb geometric designs right under this mountain. Some people think it is. You notice the honeycomb designs in red ochre right there on the wall. That is pretty fascinating, coming from a time period we know very little about. And here is a little depiction of the mountains that they think this image depicts. Now here's another shareable video, a very good look at the ruins at Çatalhöyük. Now, these places, no exterior doors. You could only go through the roof. And that just opens up some questions here that I'm going to ask. But these places were very well built. People lived here maybe for about 1,200 years, maybe as long as 2,000 years. I've seen different dates. But the fact that there were no doors, you could only go through the roof, some people have brought up important questions. And especially, I think you can connect some dots here. One very important archaeological site, not too far away. Well, let's just talk about that. And people buried under the floors. We'll have a shareable video coming up at the end that'll go over some of the archaeological work on the burials here. Now here's another shareable video. This is what they think the homes at Çatalhöyük look like. In the video that I'm going to share here at the end, they kind of narrowed the dating down between 9,100 and 7,900 years ago. I can hang out in a home that looked like this. They had the auricorns. That was very symbolic to these people. Interesting carvings there, roofs. And you could only exit these homes through the roofs. So what did that tell you about where these people descended from? Now this comes from a video I made about 3 years ago, and I'm just going to read here. And one thing that comes down from the period around 10, 12,000 years ago was a period of tremendous cold, legends of never-ending hellish winters. It says glacial relapse would have brought with it intensely long periods of snow, ice, and freezing conditions, which would have forced indigenous populations to seek refuge in cave shelters in an attempt to survive on a day-to-day basis. This was significant for Çatalhöyük folks' construction of its mostly subsurface shrines and houses, all huddled together without exterior doors or windows, was clear evidence that they had evolved from a race that had once experienced a subterranean lifestyle. One thing I think we can say for certain is the people at Çatalhöyük descended from people who went through tremendous cataclysms. I think that might be a pretty safe thing to say. But this honeycomb design found on this mural here, I think we should use some common sense what this might depict. Now, this is just a guess. Here's an artist's rendition of the honeycomb chambers at Derinkuyu. I know a lot of you have heard of this amazing underground city. Is that what this mural depicts? It's a possibility in my eyes. People surviving underground, Derinkuyu, they don't think this goes back 10, 12,000 years. But we really don't have a good answer for it, so I think this has to be presented as a possibility. This is Atlas Obscura. I have used them before. Here is a look at the amazing underground city at Derinkuyu. Did people build this just to get away from religious persecution or from warring people? Or did they build this just in order so they would survive? I think the second suggestion is probably the better one. But man, this place is huge. Did people survive in this underground city? And then their descendants build the place at Çatalhöyük? I think that is entirely possible. Now here's a story from June of 2019. A lot of stories have popped up on Çatalhöyük over the past few years, but it says 9,000 years ago, a community with modern urban problems. But there was burials here, and we're going to get a talk at the end from current archaeological work at Çatalhöyük on the burials. It says, scientists studying the ancient ruins of Çatalhöyük in modern Turkey found that its inhabitants, 3,500 to 8,000 people at its peak, experienced overcrowding, infectious diseases, violence, and environmental problems. So very modern problems were happening in Turkey 9,000 years ago. But this is just one of the places in Turkey and other places around the world that has kind of rewritten history. But these burials under the floors, now I'm going to play just a few clips from a lecture. I will leave the full link below. But this was uploaded about a week and a half ago from the European Archaeologists Association channel. I will leave that below too. You can upload any one of their videos. They make their videos shareable, so that's very cool. I have done this before, but it just gives me an opportunity to upload more info and get to some other videos. So here is some clips from that lecture. Hope you enjoyed this, and you all have a very nice day.
So this is an interesting exercise. I'm going to be talking a little bit about 25 years of excavation at a single site. It's a big site, it's a famous site. Some people even describe it as iconic. And perhaps this will explain why it's important as well as perhaps iconic. It has a variety of interesting features. However, the present work here is based on analysis of actually graves and the individuals that are inside those graves. Previously, Çatalhöyük, much of the evidence, much of the information on human remains was about the biological aspects. This actually reflects a kind of concentration of two previous phases at the site. So this is from work that started in 2012 and goes up to the present time. The site itself, and I'll leave you to look at those maps, but it tells you basically where it is. There are two mounds. Here it's called north, here south, and these are actually those shelters that are over the top of the excavated areas. So it's 13.5 hectares in size. The east mound, which this one is, but there's a west mound as well that dates after this, Chalcolithic, with a sort of sliding movement to the west, it's 21 meters high, and the sediments are deep. So it's rather like a medieval urban site in its depth. And basically it's not the origins of agriculture, but these are sedentary Neolithic people living in quite a large village or large urban form. Population estimates are between 3,500 and 8,000, and I'll say those are being revised at the moment. And again, this is, I'll take Simon's lead here. These are the shelters. This is where the labs are. And this is our chronology. This is the most recent one. Alex Bayliss from English Heritage England, is basically running, it's a stratigraphic chronology. So it's quite with hundreds of samples. What I'll be talking about largely is these words here, final, late, middle, and early. You can see the dates here. It's about 1,100 year occupation here, from about 7,100 to about 5,950 or thereabouts. This so-called middle part is sometimes referred to as the classic Çatalhöyük part. Okay? And again, I'll explain that as I go along, what that actually means, hopefully. This is kind of a quick way of introducing that without taking up too much time. Dense village site. It looks a bit like so-called pueblos in the American Southwest. It's a little bit different in that these are literally right on top of each other and next to each other. There are no streets. There's no access except through the roof. These images that James Mellart excavated in the 1960s, that's the earlier phase, before Ian Hodder took over in 1993, came up with very iconic images that have been reproduced on t-shirts, on carpets, and just about everything else. And the question is, what do they really depict? And it's always been a question of, this large raptor plucking heads off of bodies. Is that actually something we should see as representational, or is it just simply imagery or mythic? There's a huge interest in parts of the cephalic extremity, whether it's aurochs, as is here, or in fact over caprines here. And then there are also these very iconic so-called mother goddess figurines. By the way, this one is from Mellart, but there are others. Okay? So there are apparently female figures. Okay? And they look somewhat like that. The burials are quite striking. They're in platforms. This is a platform. These are, again, aurochs horns on a plastered surface. And in here are the remains of up to 60 people. And that's the way one of those looks like on excavation. It's very challenging. They're commingled and interlinked. Okay? And as we'll see, some are not completely whole. When James Mellart interpreted these burials, he saw these as what he called at that time, this is the early 1960s, he called them secondary burials. And we now know that that term was used in a variety of ways. But what he seemed to be suggesting is that these individuals were somewhere else before they went into the platforms. He thought, that those raptors were actually defleshing. It was a sign of the funerary rites that these individuals were experiencing. By the time Peter Andrews and Tyre Mollison and Bashak Baz and Laurie Haig worked on the human remains, that interpretation had changed. And at that point, it was thought that many of the individuals were going in as single inhumations, okay, and one after the other. We would call this today successive inhumation in a collective context. So a big change in interpretation. You might say, well, isn't that just fashion? Yes, in part, I suppose, but actually a lot of it is to do with the way the evidence looked. We started looking at these in a different way because of just repeated observations as we were excavating them. Some things are dislocated. Okay? That's curious. Okay? Sometimes it's called paradoxical, okay, by various colleagues. And there's variable bone representation and preservation. We started realizing that, in fact, some things were just not there. Okay. And then it's pretty clear that these were wrapped and packed. And in buildings that are burnt, which turns the platform into a kind of oven, you find actually preserved human brain, flesh, and also some of the wrappings. These are mats, okay, that are used, and various kinds of cordage. Okay. And so what we started to wonder about is, okay, so the idea was these were wrapped and then put in the ground. The past phase, they thought it went in immediately. We started to wonder about this because of these strange... Already? Oh gosh. Okay, well, I will shortly, if you don't mind. Because of these strange phenomena, we started to think about delayed burial. In other words, these individuals didn't go in immediately, but were outside for a variable period of time, and we're trying to figure out how long that might have been. And not all of the individuals are treated in this way, which again is kind of curious because one of the big things about Çatalhöyük is that supposedly it's an egalitarian society. Okay? This means basically that there aren't very many grave goods. Okay? There's spatial differentiation in the houses, okay? But those particular burials that are in the platforms are not of people that are related. Okay? This is from dental non-metric work. Okay? So that spatial, there's some kind of spatial difference. But the most important thing here is that it may be that there are social distinctions based on the amount of time an individual was kept out. Okay? The idea being that if you went in immediately, perhaps there was somebody that was not perhaps as important. Someone that stayed out was perhaps more important. Okay? In the idea that they were circulating for a longer period of time. This kind of reflects on the notion of ancestor and what that means. This is almost a throwaway term in the Neolithic. Okay? Everybody does things for the ancestors. But in this case, it might actually be the beginnings of some kind of social distinction. I am not talking about some kind of social differentiation, but a kind of social distinction. And because I've run out of time, I will stop there and take questions.